Is it racist to point out rapists? What's going on in the UK? Hello there, you awakening wonders. Wherever you're watching this, subscribe and like, and please make your way to Rumble, where we can speak freely about complex and difficult subjects, like what is going on in my country, the UK. Keir Starmer has said that people that are concerned about grooming gangs and rape gangs are jumping on a far-right racist bandwagon. So what is going on culturally in the UK around grooming gangs and that aspect of rape culture? Why is it blowing up politically now? What are the connotations of it? And why are the judiciary and institutions of power, and I would include media in that, so invested in creating particular types of stories and ignoring other stories? What does it mean? Where will it take us? And is this the end of a particular type of UK politics, i.e. a self-contained sovereignty that appears to be undergirded by bureaucracies like the EU, which the UK is no longer officially part of, or the WHO, which, hey, maybe that's on its way out, or NATO? Those things are becoming less and less popular. What will the rise of new populism mean to conventional national politics? Let's get into it. An indication that being concerned about grooming gangs might not be racist is that the brilliant British politician George Galloway, who has always aligned strongly with Muslim causes, such as the rights of the Palestinian people and British Muslims more generally, himself has expressed concerns about grooming gangs. For a while, George Galloway was the Member of Parliament for Rochdale. That's like being the Congressman for Rochdale, although that in itself seems like an extraordinary concept, talking about grooming gangs in 2024. Let's have a look at that before looking at Keir Starmer's claim that interest and concerns about grooming gangs is somehow in itself inherently racist, and decide for ourselves why these stories are being covered in this way.
George Galloway.
Madam Deputy Speaker, ever since the monster Cyril Smith, formerly of this House, but initially the Mayor of Rochdale, the town has been blighted by scandals of grooming and cover-up. We currently have 64 men in the town on bail on grooming charges. The previous Labour Mayor of Rochdale and the next Mayor of Rochdale, King's representative, were both investigated on charges of sexual malpractice towards young girls in their employ.
Would you like to be Mayor of Rochdale? I'd say I would. Well, have you been accused of sexual malpractice? I'm afraid not. Well, you'll never make it as mayor in this town.
With all the power imbalances that implies. Self-regulation, no investigation by any outside party. How can this be right? What will the minister do to help me clean up Rochdale?
Okay, now the reason that we're using that is because, as I said, George Galloway has always been a strong advocate for British Muslims. So his concern about grooming gangs in Rochdale will not have racist motivations. That's just not who George Galloway is. He's always been explicit and open in his support for Muslims. He's an old school socialist who believes in the empowerment of working class people regardless of their race or creed, an aspect of socialism that I've always found appealing. Ideas that can be found elsewhere, theologically, religiously, or spiritually. Ideas of togetherness, community, sacrifice, fraternity, the service and love of one another. Now here is Keir Starmer making the claim that anyone who has concerns about these grooming gangs must have motivations outside of the protection and care for children. What is going on? Certainly many of us have the sense that the veil laying out by conventional media and accepted institutions of power masks something deeply nefarious. And one of the aspects of emergent patriotism and right-wing politics, and certainly populism, is a desire for people to return to some kind of integrity, authenticity, and personal sovereignty and control over your own communities and neighborhoods. And that needn't necessarily equate with racism and bigotry. But let me know in the comments and chat what you think about that. Here's what Keir Starmer thinks of it all.
Typically reserved, today the Prime Minister impassioned.
here I am. I'm feeling quite passionate. I will not tolerate. I'm actually feeling quite passionate about that now. Actually, in fact, I'm doing it. Yep, the farts come out.
What I won't tolerate is politicians jumping on the bandwagon simply to get attention.
By the way, that's all politicians do the whole time, isn't it? Like, if there's some media story, should we comment on this media story? That's all they do all day long, is try to capitalise. In our country, there was a mad story about post offices. That's like the equivalent of your mail service having all sorts of mad corruption. A bunch of people were condemned and accused of all sorts of stuff, like, financial misdemeanors. Some of them killed themselves. Then it was discovered that there was some faulty bit of software. The government knew about it earlier. And they jumped on that stuff when it became convenient to do so, because there was a hit TV show about it. Politicians are almost, it seems, by their nature, kind of vultures of stories that can be utilised and deployed to advance their interests. So Keir Starmer making that claim there is outrageous and incredibly hypocritical.
When those politicians sat in government for 14 long years.
A woman just casually picking her teeth. Oh, yeah. I hear you, mate. Yeah, that's the British for you. No matter what's being said, we'll always be thinking about our dentistry. That's why we're famous for having great teeth. Yeah, baby! Yeah.
Tweeting, talking, but not doing anything about it. Now so desperate for attention that they're amplifying what the far right is saying.
But the Conservatives doubling down and promising a push in the Commons for a national inquiry.
Keir Starmer's claims this morning are absolutely disgraceful. It is not correct to brand as far right people who are raising legitimate concerns about the systemic, organised gang rape of vulnerable young girls.
Well, there was George Galloway raising those concerns in 2024 in April. And George Galloway may be many things, but he is not far right.
This wasn't the start to the year that Number 10 expected.
Sometimes I watch British news and British culture and wonder how Elon Musk can even be bothered to comment on it, because it seems so mad and old-fashioned.
But far from being knocked off course, I'm told it was a deliberate choice by the Prime Minister to wade into this row, partly because he's angry about the safety risks it's posing for his MPs, but also because, in the words of one ally, he's authentically passionate about tackling child sexual exploitation and simply wasn't prepared to duck the issue.
He's authentically passionate. You don't think that it's just he's concerned that he's going to lose power, that after an apparently successful and reportedly landslide victory, his government is teetering on the brink of crisis after crisis as people realise that the old neoliberal, centralised political ideas no longer serve them. That politicians like Keir Starmer, who are basically authoritarians, himself merging out of the CPS, the person that started 24-hour courts when there were the London riots, the person that ignored the Julian Assange frankly illegal incarceration in Belmarsh, is not the sort of person that can run a country in accordance with the will and wishes with the British people, no matter how many tools his father may have made. And his dad was a toolmaker. I don't know if you knew that. A matter of days from the inauguration, and surely Judgment Day from all those scammers and blackguards that benefited during the pandemic. Yes, the COVID reckoning is upon us, and it's time for you to get the ultimate spike detox. Whether you're suffering from severe side effects or experiencing long COVID, how bloody long, check out this natural solution formulated by the great Dr. Peter McCulloch in collaboration with The Wellness Company. Introducing the 3-in-1 Ultimate Spike Detox, conveniently consolidated into one little capsule with 4 times more nattokinase. You can never have enough nattokinase, can you? 500 milligrams of bromelain and 500 milligrams of turmeric root extract. What is nattokinase, by the way? Nattokinase is an enzyme researched for its anti-clotting effects. It may work to break down spike proteins. That's the hope, kids. Combined with bromelain and curcumin, it provides a potent blend for detoxification and cellular support. Crafted with 100% natural ingredients, Ultimate Spike Detox is backed by research. People aren't just guessing, there's research. Offering effective support for your cells' natural repair and recovery. Experience the only formula approved and used by Dr. McCulloch, a top freedom-fighting doctor who risked it all. You plucky go-getter. Head to twc.health/brand and use the code BRAND to get 10% off plus free shipping. Again, that's twc.health/brand and use the code brand to get 10% off and free shipping. Back to the content.
To that end, the government today announced plans to strengthen laws on child sexual abuse.
We've got to strengthen those laws. If the laws against child sexual abuse are not strong enough, what kind of country are we living in? Like, what are the laws? Don't sexually abuse children. Right, there you go. That should do the trick, shouldn't it? Also, if there are grooming gangs, investigate them thoroughly. How about that?
But that's unlikely to calm a row that's as much about personalities and populism as policy.
Also, though, you can see that old institutional power is quaking and shaking. Britain is still not fully recovered from Southport. People recognised probably prior to the election that led to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party's victory because Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party were so dreadfully unpopular that they were essentially electing a new hue of the same old crap. And what's required is radical change, real meaningful change, a real open, transparent conversation. And there are people that are willing to have those conversations, and seemingly now the current institutions are scrambling to assess how to repress and control those conversations. Frankly, in short, Elon Musk, whatever your views on him, is too powerful for them to control. That's a factor that they aren't able to mitigate or handle yet. Here's a piece of journalism on the British grooming gang scandal that will give you some deeper insights. Let's get into it. Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips' decision to block a public inquiry into the Oldham grooming gang seems from the outside to be almost inexplicable. Children were raped and abused by gangs of men while the authorities failed to protect them. Seems like there should be an inquiry. Let me know in the comments and chat. A review of the abuse in Oldham was released in 2022, but its terms of reference only stretched from 2011 to 2014. Survivors from the town said they wanted a government-led inquiry to cover a longer period and catch what the previous review had missed. In Jess Phillips' letter to the council revealed by GB News, she says she understood the strength of feeling in the town before it best for another local review to take place. Obviously, people have strong feelings when grooming gangs rape young people. Clearly, there's a requirement for a massive reassessment in the way that these things are viewed and publicly handled. Clearly, this is further evidence that people generally don't trust their government, don't trust their media, don't trust their judiciary, and want real change. This is a scandal that should be rooted out entirely and investigated by the full might of the British state. Voices ranging from Elon Musk to Kemi Badenoch have joined the calls for an inquiry. Yet the government seems curiously reluctant to dig into the failings of officials. Why would that be? When there is an inability or an unwillingness to undertake intrepid and meaningful inquiries of this type, skepticism and cynicism lead to imagination, rumination, and sometimes unfounded inquiry. Consider the inquiries around COVID. When the COVID inquiries in the UK didn't cover vaccine injury, didn't correctly cover whether or not there were clinical trials, didn't cover the relationship between government officials and Moderna staff members, didn't cover why Pfizer were allowed to cover up for 75 years their clinical data, people start to think, maybe there's an unusual relationship between the government and the pharmaceutical industry. Now, it's likely that people will have similar questions if there's not a robust investigation into this matter. Let me know in the comments and chat what you think. This reluctance is not new. Across the country, in towns and in cities, on our streets and in the state institutions designed to protect the most vulnerable members of our society, authorities deliberately turned a blind eye to horrific abuse of largely white children by gangs of men predominantly of Pakistani heritage. I mean, that does seem like an extraordinary phenomena. Majority white children, majority Pakistani men. This seems like something that would suggest a cultural problem worthy of investigation. I've seen people elsewhere on various online channels saying that there are paedophile rings of all colours and persuasions, and of course that's true. Just look at the child trafficking crisis in the United States of America. Hundreds of thousands of children are apparently being trafficked and have gone missing. This appears to be a global problem, and locating it entirely within one racial or cultural group don't seem right. Then Pakistani men, I'm sure, are Muslims, and I would imagine that Islam has pretty strong edicts, hadiths, and legislation against the abuse of the vulnerable. Nevertheless, when a country is under febrile and turgid tension on the subject of migration, it's not surprising that the dynamic described there, largely Pakistani men, largely white children, leads to social tension, particularly at a time where migration in many European countries, even European countries without an imperial and colonial past like island appear to similarly be experiencing tensions the majority of people are concerned about. Over time, details have come to light about the abuse in Rotherham, in Telford, in Rochdale and in dozens of other places, but with stories released in dribs and drabs and the details so horrific as to be almost unreadable, the full scale of the scandal still has to reach the public. When an independent review was finally published in 2022, it found police officers described parts of Telford as a no-go area, while witnesses set out multiple allegations of police corruption and favouritism towards Pakistani community. Regardless of the reason, the inquiry found that there was a nervousness about race bordering on a reluctance to investigate crimes committed by what was described as the Asian community. Similar concerns applied at the council, where anxieties over appearing racist saw safeguarding officers waving away concerns simply because the perpetrators were Asian, waving them away. It felt that some suspects were not investigated because it had been politically incorrect. Did you rape any children? I may have done. And where are you from? Asia. Oh. Mind how you go. And above all, there was the concern over community relations. Senior council staff were terrified that the abuse of children had the potential to start a race riot. The result was stasis, despite the officials acknowledging, in at least one case, that abuse by Asian men had gone on for years and years. It had. At least 1,000 girls were abused in the town between 1980 and 2009, yet even this conservative estimate was disputed by authority figures, with West Mercia Police Superintendent Tom Harding insisting in 2018 the figure was sensationalised. An independent review later found it entirely plausible. Denial about the extent of the problem is rooted deep in Britain's political system. At times it appears that the government's approach to multiculturalism is not to uphold the law, but instead to minimise the risk of unrest between communities. Confronted with gangs of predominantly Pakistani men targeting predominantly white children, the state knew exactly what to do. For the good of community relations, it had to bury the story. That seems like an extraordinary choice to make. Let me know what you think in the comments and the chat. And again, I would like to reiterate that my general stance is that what interests me is that George Galloway, who has always been a prominent ally of British Muslims, himself recognised this problem. To say that grooming gangs are Muslim is not to say all Muslims are grooming gangs. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, what the agenda and interests of the government are, and if it extends even beyond keeping peace between different religious and racial communities. In Rotherham, a senior police officer told a distressed father that the town would erupt if the routine abuse of white children by Pakistani heritage men became public knowledge. One parent, concerned about a missing daughter, was told by the police that an older Asian boyfriend was a fashion accessory for girls in the town. That's not going to catch on, is it? Have you met Mustafa? Have you thought about a hairband? Or maybe a purse? No, I'm sticking with this guy. The father of a 15-year-old rape victim was told the assault might mean she would learn her lesson. As the 2014 J inquiry into Rotherham found, children were doused in petrol and threatened with being set alight, threatened with guns, witnessed brutally violent rapes, and were threatened that they would be the next victim if they told anyone. Girls as young as 11 were raped by large numbers of male perpetrators, one after the other. Actually, I didn't expect this story was going to get as dark and as horrific as it clearly is, even though I came into this story knowing it was about grooming gangs and the abuse of children. This is a terrifying and extraordinary case. And if half of what's being talked about here is true, there needs to be, I would say, a massive inquiry. And no wonder there's an atmosphere of tension and fraught hostility across the UK if this is true. In the same town, a senior police officer allegedly said the abuse had been going on for 30 years, adding, with it being Asians, we can't afford for this to be coming out. As Louise Casey's 2015 report on Rotherham Council found, this attitude was widespread. The Pakistani community accounted for around 3% of the town's population, and the story emerging was clear. Pakistani men were grooming white girls. As a result, one witness said the council was terrified of the impact on community cohesion. Across the town, pressure was put on people to suppress, keep quiet, or cover up issues around child abuse. A former senior officer told her review that X didn't want the town to become the child abuse capital of the North. They didn't want riots. Yeah, you can't put that on a poster. Child abuse capital of the North. Vacation? Politicians were terrified of the impact on community cohesion. This nervousness meant there was a sense that it was the Pakistani heritage councillors who alone dealt with that community, with their having disproportionate influence on the councils. As one witness put it, my experience of council as it was and is, Asian men were very powerful and the British are very mindful of racism and frightened of racism allegations, so there is no robust challenge. Other concerns may have been even more sinister. In 2016, it was repeated that a victim of grooming in Rotherham had alleged that she was raped by a town councillor. As a result of this combination of factors, factors, the council went to great lengths to cover up information and silence whistleblowers. In the words of witnesses, if you want to keep your job, you keep your head down and shut your mouth. This resistance to obvious truth repeated itself across the country. By 2010, a West Midlands report showed that authorities were aware that grooming gangs were approaching children at school gates. But as the report stated, the predominant offender profile of Pakistani Muslim males, combined with the predominant victim profile of white females, has the potential to cause significant community tensions. As a result, the report remained unpublished until released in response to the Freedom of Information request 5 years later. That's the kind of thing that will lead to racism. The idea that there aren't transparent and open conversations when there are legitimate concerns. If you repress and control that, you will create the necessity, in fact, for someone like Tommy Robinson, who has the bravery as well as some evident flaws to risk getting into this kind of conversation. Tommy Robinson remains a controversial figure. You saw how Piers Morgan discussed his contribution to British cultural life. But if this is true, and part of Tommy Robinson's mission is to expose problems of this nature, banging Tommy Robinson in jail does not make it look like the most significant problem Britain faces is the racism of white people. It looks like this is a significant problem. And I say that as a person who wholly and truly believes in the possibility of harmony between people. But the cost of that harmony is transparency, integrity, authenticity, openness, not hushing up and repressing significant stories just because the optics ain't great. In Manchester, a 2019 report concluded gangs were left to roam the streets in part because officers were told to look elsewhere. One detective constable was quoted by a report as saying, "The offending target group were predominantly Asian males and we were told to try and get other ethnicities." It's DEI! We want paedophiles of all colours! Central government took a similar view in 2020. The Home Office refused to release its research into grooming gangs, claiming it would not be in the public interest to do so. When it was finally released, it turned out to be a whitewash, a shoddy construction which appeared to deliberately downplay the clear role ethnicity had played in the phenomenon. When people did try to raise the issue, they found themselves shouted down. In 2004, a Channel 4 documentary into abuse in Bradford was delayed after police forces warned the evidence of Asian men targeting white girls could inflame racial tensions. When the first convictions in Rochdale were handed down in 2012, a police and Crown Prosecution Service apologised for failing to follow up on appeals for help. As former Labour MP for Cayley, Anne Cryer, put it, the authorities were petrified of being called racist and so reverted to the default of political correctness. As a result, despite a child telling the police she'd been raped and providing DNA evidence, no prosecution was brought. DNA evidence! The sense that authorities believed that a full investigation would be more trouble than it was worth is widespread. Simon Danczuk, the former MP for Rochdale, has said senior Labour politicians warned him against discussing the ethnicity of the perpetrators for fear of losing votes. Today, dozens of offenders are still believed to be at large in the community. While fears over racial tensions and political correctness have left the state frequently unwilling to protect victims, the same concerns have seen attackers protected. As the J inquiry into Rotherham found in 2014, in at least 2 cases, fathers tracked down their daughters and attempted to remove them from houses where they were being abused. The police arrested the fathers. That can't be true. That's nightmare fuel, isn't it? The idea that your daughter could be taken, you track them down, you liberate them, and the police arrest you. These are the kind of stories that do cause significant fissures. And the idea that the mainstream news are reporting this as a minor matter seems to me to be a significant misstep. Because whilst proportionately this might not be happening on a scale where everyone's children are at risk, in terms of the severity of the nature of this problem, it's something that has to be routed out, exposed, investigated, proven, and justly handled. Surely. In other cases, child victims were arrested for drunken, disorderly behaviour rather than the adult men they were with. That's sort of beyond parody. This child is drunk. How do you expect to perform decent fellatio in that state? You're under arrest. The protection of offenders may have gone further still. In at least one case, when a victim found the courage to go to police, their abuser appears to have been tipped off. While still in the police station, one child received a text from her abuser informing her that he had her 11-year-old sister and it was now your choice. The child chose not to go through with the complaint. These stories cover only a small number of towns. The broader picture, however, is clear. The consequences are clear too. No police officer or government employee has ever been in prison for their misconduct. Indeed, in Rotherham, which remember, George Galloway, hardly a racist, hardly hard right, talking about this in April 24, specifically about Rotherham. In Rotherham, the harshest sanctions faced by the police were written warnings. Even offenders have managed to dodge some of the consequences for their actions. Despite being stripped of British citizenship, the leader of a Rochdale grooming gang still lives among his victims despite being ordered to be deported. This is the kind of thing that will lead to populism, that will lead to nationalism, that will lead to disharmony, because the events themselves are significant and disgusting, and then the handling of it has been appalling. And even now, Keir Starmer is attempting to report on this as if the problem is racism. Well, that doesn't seem to be the problem, and I say that as someone who has an open heart to all faiths, all religions, and all cultures. And I actually believe in what institutional politicians claim to believe in. Democracy, the will of the people ought to be represented. If people have a democratic will about how their community should be governed, whether you agree with them or not, that's how it should be governed. In a functioning and healthy democracy, there will be many times where administrators would say, well, I would advocate for this route. We think migration is fantastic. We want a melting pot. And the people would say, we don't want that now. And the administrators would say, okay, well, it's your country. If Britain is to redeem itself for the grooming gang scandal, it needs to understand how it got things so terribly wrong. This begins with the attitude that protecting the image of a successful multicultural society matters more than the actual truth of that multicultural society. It isn't hard to see why councils panicked when confronted with the sheer scale of the abuse. As a recent study calculated, 1 in 73 Muslim men living in Rotherham were prosecuted for their involvement in these gangs from 1997 to 2016. This was an almost unsolvable problem for a society built on liberal principles. Even now, discussing primarily Pakistani heritage grooming gangs as primarily Pakistani heritage grooming gangs causes problems. IPSO waded in to censure Home Office Secretary Suella Braverman for this claim last year, citing deeply flawed Home Office research in its ruling. Yet if we can't be honest about the problems we're facing, we won't be able to address them. In the words of Guy Dampier, a researcher at the Gattam Institute think tank, the rape gang scandal was a product of multiculturalism, which in practice meant the authorities turning a blind eye because victims were mostly white and their abusers largely ethnically Pakistani. Anti-racism charities, pressure groups and left-wing academics all conspired to stifle discussions or lie that it was only a moral panic. The result is thousands of abused girls and a scandal which has scarred British politics. Fixing this mess starts by uncovering everything. As research by Charlie Peters has shown, these gangs have been active in over 50 towns and villages across the UK, and there are no doubt more that we've yet to hear about. Even as recently as 2021, it emerged that South Yorkshire Police was still failing to record the ethnicity of offenders, with 60% of cases lacking details in Rotherham. The state must leave no stone unturned in its effort to root out this evil, and above all, concerns over multiculturalism must no longer be allowed to outweigh the need to keep the public safe. Children were abandoned to suffer in the name of community relations, an unforgivable price, and it was a price that bought nothing. Harmony based on lies doesn't last. Well, that's a pretty breathtaking story to unpack. Remember, we've looked at Keir Starmer's attempt to frame people's concerns about this as motivated by racism. That's why we very deliberately showed you George Galloway, a strong advocate for British Muslims having the same concerns. And anyone that's heard that article out of the British newspaper, The Telegraph, would have strong concerns that there has been a cover-up and there's not been a significant inquiry, and then there needs to be a radical revision. Because if Keir Starmer and the British government are concerned about the safety of children and women and girls, this is precisely the kind of inquiry that needs to take place. And concocting cultures based on lies, lacking in transparency, authenticity and integrity, will lead to populist figures like Tommy Robinson gaining massive traction, and media magnates of an unprecedented scale like Elon Musk having colossal and incalculable influence. Therefore, you don't actually need to scrutinise and analyse the ethics of either Elon Musk or Tommy Robinson. You simply have to look at the facts of this story. And when you do, you're left with significant questions about the way that Britain is governed, the way that British media behaves, the way that the British judiciary behaves, and what the biases might be. And if you're left with a lot of questions about multiculturalism more generally, then that's hardly surprising given the nature of this cover-up. I would like to once again reiterate what my position is. I believe in harmony. I believe in one human family. But you can't have that without integrity, authenticity, and openness. And that is what we hope to bring you on this channel. And hopefully the love that we feel for the majority of people of all colours and persuasions that are not interested in exploiting and abusing children and women or anyone is significant and sufficient for us to navigate a very difficult topic. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and the chat. Remember, we stream 4 days a week on Rumble. That's where you can find our content unexpurgated and unedited. And that seems increasingly unlikely in my former home country, the United Kingdom. Become a member of Rumble Premium if you can. More important than any of that, if you can, please stay free.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.